Right, the magic is happening. Yeah.
Okay, good morning everyone. Happy Friday. My name's Chris. I'm the programme lead for Game Art, Esports and Media in the CAN division. If you had a chance to have a go at the quiz, I'm going to go through some of the answers in a minute. But the learning walk that the learning breakfast, that I'm doing today is about something called Factfulness. It's actually around this book that I've just recently finished. And really, Factfulness is just a fancy word for critical thinking, which is something we obviously all do at the college and teach the students. But it's a really interesting approach to it, and I thought it was worth talking about. So, the quiz that people did, which was this quiz, is the quiz that's set out at the beginning of the book. So I'll give you a bit of an introduction to the book in a second, but basically, if you manage to fill this in, this was about your worldview, what you think about the world. And if I can just click on, and have I put, I think I might have put the wrong link on there, that's really annoying. Okay, no worries. So the results from that would have been, or will be, quite interesting. And I'm really intrigued, and I'll try and post something out later to let people know what the results were. But the person who wrote this book, Hans Rosling, has done this same quiz, the quiz that those of you that managed to do that have just done. World leaders have done those. So the heads of banks have done them. All sorts of different influential people in the world have done that exact same quiz. And it turns out that when people do that quiz, the results are quite kind of shocking in that most people score very, very poorly on that quiz. And the types of questions on there are, how many female kids have got access to primary school in the world? How many people have got access to electricity in the world? Basically, it talks about the gap between the developed world and the undeveloped world. And it turns out that we've all got a very distorted view of the world. And Hans makes this point in the book that actually most of our worldview is stuck in the 1960s. And that since then we haven't actually updated our worldview. And I thought this was a really interesting concept, and the book goes into it a lot more. Basically, spoiler for the book, because I'm going to go through a few of the things, but if you are interested, the link to it's there. But I've also got a website that kind of condenses it if you're interested in some of the key points. But he argues that the world is getting a better place, and the whole book is about justifying that. And that it is possible for us to hold these two differing ideas in our heads, which is horrible things are happening, really bad things happening in the world, and yet the world is still getting better. And he calls it factfulness, and it's basically just kind of trying to update people's worldview and update people's ideas on things using statistics and using data. All of the data that he goes through is freely available by the UN, the United Nations. Each of the chapters in the book is a different instinct, and this is why I thought it was really interesting from a teaching point of view and from education, because these are all the instincts as human beings we have to fight in order to retain our critical thinking, our ability to critical think. All of these things kind of push us away from that idea of being able to look at something critically, analyse all of the issues around it, and make the correct decision on something. And just to go through a couple of them, the gap instincts is what I said before. It's that idea that we think of things in binary terms, rich and poor, or developed and undeveloped, or in the case of education, high learners and low learners. We often kind of split those two groups out. And as a consequence, the stuff in the middle, the people in the middle, are actually the majority. So he kind of splits the world into 4 levels. In terms of development, and so we're on level 4, of course, in one of the most developed parts of the world, and then extreme poverty, places like the Congo, for instance, are at the lowest level. The majority of people are sat in between, and he argues that it takes about 20 years or a generation to go up through the levels. And so in his time, he was born in 1948, Sweden was at level 2. when he was born, and it's now at level 4. So it talks about that moving, and I've been having chats with some of my colleagues. You know, we were talking about manufacturing and things, and service industry in this country. And one of the consequences of this kind of idea is that we often think manufacturing is in places like China and other places now. That's going to change, because manufacturing will go to emerging developing countries. So as level 1 countries go to level 2, the manufacturing will go somewhere else. And so there's obviously interesting things that happen, but so that gap instinct, just to pick up another couple of ones, the negativity instinct, we tend to focus on the negative. I mean, how many times have you heard someone either in the staff room or somewhere else go, well, the worst case scenario is, because that's what we naturally think about, that's what we naturally go to, and that's what we plan for. And so often those things aren't, they're way more nuanced, of course. It usually isn't the worst case scenario, but we like to think in those ways. And again, the book makes a big point that our media will definitely go to those things, because those are the things that make the stories. And so that's constantly kind of fiddling with our worldview on things. The urgency instinct and the fear instinct were the two things that I found kind of most interesting, especially in an educational setting. We often find ourselves up against it in terms of time. We try to plan ahead. There's massively complicated business education and what we do. And so when you combine things that we're scared of and things that ignite our fear effect and the urgency, it shuts our ability to critical think down. Urgency is one of the worst things for that. And so when people, either in the media or in education or anywhere else, goes, no, we have to make a decision now, that is often, not saying it's deliberately manipulating us, but it shuts your ability to think about something critically down. And he makes the point, it generally, usually is not the point. I just picked out this one quote about the urgency instinct, which I thought was brilliant. He says that if we thought there might be a lion in the grass, it was sensible not to do too much analysis. Those who stopped and carefully analysed the probabilities are not our ancestors. We are the offspring of those who decided to act quickly with insufficient information. Which I thought kind of really does illustrate how we think about a lot of these different things. So yeah, kind of looking at all these things and being aware of them. And I don't think there's any new information here. I think you're all well aware of these things, but when you see it kind of laid out like this and explained in the way that it is, it's really kind of stark and interesting. So in terms of how this applies to working in education, there's a bunch of things that, so long as we're aware of, and I'm well aware that we do a lot of these things already. And having worked at a number of different places, I realised working at Burnley, we do some of these particularly well. But again, that's kind of part of the point, is not to take our eye off the ball and to make sure that we're aware of them and carrying on. So thinking about those students in the middle that often get forgotten, the quiet ones that are your steady learners that never get kind of, if left on their own, they're going to do solid work, but they're not going to excel, but they're not necessarily going to fail either, they're just going to continue. And remembering those learners constantly in class. Things like, I did add my notes, I forgot to print them out. So like I said, we tend to think in very structured ways, and that urgency instinct is something that we have to be really, really careful about. Blame, one of the things was the blame instinct. Another thing that shuts our ability to critical think down is that we often, as humans, and I don't think we do, well, I'd like to think we don't do this particularly in education, but we often like to look for blame. And when you look for blame, when you find blame, or you think you find blame, you tend to stop looking anywhere else. And actually, the blame isn't the point, is it? It's the thing behind it, it's what's causing it. So whether it's anybody's fault or not, it's how do we stop this thing again? How do we prevent these things from happening? And we're seeing that a lot, as he points out, in world politics at the moment, especially around global warming and those types of things. We're seeing a lot of blame being associated, but actually that's just distracting from what actually needs to happen. And there's, we tend to think in extremes. So the gap instinct, I suppose, I've talked about that. It's really important, and I think this is the one that I want to take away from my learners, is trying to have multiple perspectives. Again, something you often hear for people is, what do you stand for? You know, what's that one thing that defines you or stands for you? And we really need to get away from that and think we can have multiple perspectives. Something I find myself talking to my students quite a lot about is, it's okay to feel that way and think that way, but we can also accept that this is possible as well. We can also do this, can't we? The students really like to think in those binary ways, because that's part of development and growing up, of course. I'm going to finish off with a word from the man himself. I won't put the whole video on because I think I'm just about on time. There's lots and lots of videos from Hans. He was quite a regular TED talker, of course, about some of these ideas, and has done a bunch of things. He did this 4-minute video with the BBC to visualise the development and change over the last 200 years of the world. Just going to put the last couple of minutes on because it kind of illustrates the point.
By HIV, and now we can see the world today in the most up-to-date statistics. Most people today live in the middle, but there are huge differences at the same time between the best of countries and the worst of countries. And there are also huge inequalities within countries. These bubbles show country averages, but I can split them. Take China, I can split it into provinces. There goes Shanghai. It has the same wealth and health as Italy today. And there is the poor inland province Guizhou. It is like Pakistan. And if I split it further, the rural parts are like Ghana in Africa.
And yet, despite the enormous disparities today, we have seen 200 years of remarkable progress. That huge historical gap between the West and the rest is now closing. We have become an entirely new converging world. And I see a clear trend into the future. With aid, trade, green technology and peace, it's fully possible that everyone can make it to the healthy, wealthy corner.
Well, what you just seen in the last few minutes is a story of 200 countries shown over 200 years and beyond. It involved plotting of 120,000 numbers. Pretty neat, huh?
So, even though we've got all these instincts that are fighting against us, the world is getting a better place, and sometimes I think it's worth reminding the students about that. Thank you very much.
Folks, before you escape, 2 things. If you haven't already scanned your ID badge to log your attendance, please do that before you escape. And the other one is, conveniently, you've got a book just there, I'm going to steal it. If you can, next week, can you bring your favourite book in? If you forget it, you can still turn up. It's okay, I'm not checking at the door. It's alright. But you can remember, try and bring your favourite book in. Right? The Hobbit. Right, thanks very much. Have a lovely day, lovely weekend. Thanks, Chris. Super. Really interesting, yeah.